Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much to everyone for joining us tonight. My name is David Chayevitz. I'm a professor of Jewish history at Northwestern and currently the director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies. And it's really my pleasure to welcome you to this year's, the first in a two-part series that's serving as this year's annual Manfred H. Vogel Memorial Lecture in Judaic Studies. Let me start by acknowledging the people who made tonight's lecture, panel rather, possible. First, I want to express my gratitude to Henry and Maria Vogel, who together with their family endowed the Vogel Lecture 8 years ago to honor their father, Manfred Vogel, who was a longtime professor and really a pillar of the Northwestern community. For more than 40 years, Professor Vogel educated generations of Northwestern students and helped to cement the field of Jewish studies here at Northwestern and really around the country, in addition to publishing dozens of books and articles in the field of modern Jewish thought. Much of the success of the Crown Family Center ultimately traces back to his pioneering efforts, and we're so fortunate to be able to honor his memory tonight through this event and through others like it, which share cutting-edge scholarship in the field of Jewish studies with the broader community on and beyond the Northwestern campus. The Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies today boasts over a dozen full-time faculty members who specialize in ancient, medieval, and modern Jewish history, Jewish philosophy and thought, Yiddish, Hebrew, and Ladino literature, Holocaust studies, and study of the history, politics, and culture of the State of Israel. Undergraduate students at Northwestern can major and minor in Jewish studies. Graduate students from a multitude of fields and disciplines collaborate in the university's Jewish Studies graduate cluster, and an array of postdoctoral fellows and affiliated scholars join the center each year to continue their training and prepare for careers in and beyond the academy. In addition to this inward-facing activity, the Crown's Family Center also faces outward to the broader public and hosts events and programming that are designed to bridge the gap between the university and the Chicagoland community. I'm going to be putting into the chat, for those who are able to see it, a link to our website where you can learn more about some upcoming events and also find out about opportunities to partner with us in supporting programming like this in the future. And let me especially flag the second part of this panel series, which is going to be held exactly a week from now, next Thursday evening at 7. And if you haven't yet registered for that one, please, I would encourage you to do so. Let me also just briefly thank two members of the Crown Center's administrative team, Nancy Gelman and Katie Genio, without whom this event and really all of our programming would not be possible. So thanks so much to them. In just a moment, I'm going to introduce the moderator for tonight's panel, but let me just briefly say a word about the rationale for this event. Scholars of Jewish history have long been attuned to the overlap and sometimes the disconnect or the disjuncture between critical history on the one hand and collective memory on the other. But over the last few years, we've seen the ramifications of this tension explode into public consciousness in the US and beyond, maybe most notably in the debates over the past several years over the preservation of Confederate monuments and other historical relics of earlier American history. But strikingly, what we saw a few years ago in Charlottesville, and especially this past week at the Capitol, was really a remarkable overlap between public displays of Confederate symbolism and public displays of anti-Semitism, and the sort of tensions surrounding public memory and history and their interrelationship come out very strongly in both of those cases. And so tonight, we want to give our community the opportunity to gain some scholarly insight into these topics and to their historical and conceptual interrelationships from an all-star cast of leading scholars in the field. And those scholars will be introduced by the moderator for tonight's panel, which is Professor Schmule Keneally, who is an assistant professor of political science at Northwestern. His recent work focuses on many different topics, including collective agency, public policy, political philosophy. His recent books include The People's Duty, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2019, Integrity, Personal and Political, published a year later by Oxford University Press in 2020. He also last year published an article having to do with public monuments and memory and honors that appeared in the flagship journal Ethics. So really a remarkably appropriate scholar to be guiding all of our thinking and conversations around this very important topic. And I'll turn it over to him. One word actually, sorry, before I do turn it over to him, just in terms of format, please feel free to enter questions into our chat. after each of our presenters has had a chance to speak and after there's been some conversation among them, I'm going to jump back in to moderate some Q&A based on the questions that are submitted by our audience members. So please do feel free to add questions or comments as we go along, and I'll be presenting some of those to our panelists at the end. Thanks so much, Professor Keneally.
Thank you, David. Hello, everyone. It's an honor to take part and to moderate to the best of my ability. I'm really looking forward to the presentation today. It's my first honor to introduce the fellow panelists. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm just going to go alphabetically here, not by order of presentation. It's especially an honor to be surrounded by such award-winning panelists. Adam Domby is the first of them. He is an award-winning historian of the Civil War, Reconstruction in the American South. He's the author of one of the most aptly titled, or at the very least, not just aptly titled, but pertinently titled, The False Cause, Fraud, Fabrication, and White Supremacy in Confederate Memory, alongside forthcoming article with our very own fellow panelist, Shari Rabin, on Jewish loyalty during the Civil War in the Journal of Southern History. Adam is also the former associate director of the Perlstein-Lipov Center for Southern Jewish Culture and is an assistant professor of history at the College of Charleston. Shari, his co-author, Shari Rabin, is an assistant professor of Jewish Studies and Religion at Oberlin. She is the author of yet another award-winning book, aptly titled Jews on the Frontier, Religion and Mobility in 19th Century America. Came out of NYU in 2017. And Shari is currently at work on a history of Jews, religion, and race in the American South, where I've recently learned she partly grew up in, from the 17th century to the present day. And last but very far from least, Magda Teller is professor of history in the Schwiller Chair of Judaic Studies at Fordham. She has an extraordinarily long list of honors, titles, publications, fellowships, and I think it might take the bulk of our conversation if I try to go through all of them. But very briefly, she's a fellow of the American Academy for Jewish Research, the author of multiple books, among them Jews and Heretics in Catholic Poland with Cambridge, 2005, Sinners on Trial, Harvard, 2011, Blood Libel, On the Trail of an Anti-Semitic Myth, Harvard, came out 2020. 2 edited volumes, and the list goes on in languages, English, Hebrew, Italian, Polish publications, fellowships with Guggenheim, Eric Frank, Yad Nadiv, a very prominent foundation in Israel, among others, and the list really does go on. So an honor to be with you all. And if I remember correctly, Magda will actually kick us off. So I will just turn it over to you, Magda, and looking forward to the presentation.
Okay, so I am very honored to be included in this panel. It's the topic of history memory is of course not a new one in the field of Jewish studies, but it has come to fore certainly in the past few years, as was said, but also in this year during the pandemic with the coverage of pandemic and thinking about Jews and pandemic. But one of the questions that I would like to, or several questions that I would like to just touch upon was, what do we know and why do we know it? Why do we return to certain events when we recall them in public monuments or in public art or in popular newspapers or even Jewish historiography? But what is it that we don't remember, that we sort of confined to oblivion, and why? And there could be a lot of aspects that we could discuss, but I want to focus on, because of the short number of minutes that I have, of the case of blood libel, which was an accusation that Jews killed Christian children to obtain their blood for different kinds of uses that emerged in the Middle Ages. And it still is believed, it still continues, is alive, even though it's centuries old. The Poway synagogue shooter near San Diego referred to one of the victims of, one of the children who was said to be a victim of Jews in anti-Jewish literature and anti-Jewish trials as one of the causes for his actions. But what are the assumptions about blood libel? And blood libel can be an interesting lens into historical memory. So one thing is that blood libels are medieval. The other thing is that blood libels always resulted in Jewish deaths and persecution. And the preservation and the iconic images that are associated with it. If you ever looked or read anything about blood libel, I can guarantee you that you likely saw this image from 1493, a print edition of a book from Nuremberg. Or if you read any Jewish press, you might have seen an image from Poland of a painting that is in a Polish church. So images also, like statues, also transmit certain kind of memory. So I just want to show you a couple of things that what is actually not remembered, where is the disjunction between the memory and the history. So one of the things is that this is a medieval accusation, that the blood libels are medieval. My book has a website which you can interact with these maps. So I just have slides for that, but you can play with the maps on the website. And this is for the period medieval from 1144, the supposed first accusation against Jews, to 1450. You see only about 23 cases, if we can call them cases, but most of them, 17, come only as mentions in Chronicles. One line mentions in Chronicles. We actually don't know whether they happened or whether it was just some kind of a rumor who somebody heard and then wrote it down in Chronicles as the medieval Chronicles sanctioned. When you look at the period from 1450 to 1830, and it really the only image here, the only dot here is from 1830, but it's really to the end of the 19th century. You see that the majority of the 83 cases are from not the medieval period. So the blood libel is not a medieval phenomenon. It emerges in the medieval period, but in fact, the bulk of those accusations happened, and I say here happened because we have legal sources for that, happened in the later period. The period that is typically seen as the transformative period leading up to modernity, the early modern period. Well, it's much darker here. The other point that I mentioned is the assumption that there was always persecution and prosecution of Jews. So here you have, again, take it with a grain of salt. Some of it is just from one-line Chronicles for the 23 stories from the medieval period. And in 8, it said that Jews were killed one way or the other. Again, it's a said, we don't know whether some of these cases happened, but there were also 7 in which they were not. The contrast is even starker in the, and then here's a reminder where these stories come from, in the early modern period, where the outcomes, even though we have such a vast majority of these stories and cases coming through, the majority of them are in fact cases which were either accusations that were dismissed or Jews were actually acquitted. So again, but what we do not remember is we don't remember those 48 stories that are actually dominate the history of blood libel. What we do remember, and we remember it through historiography, not just the sources from the period, but even modern historiography, is those stories in which resulted in Jews' deaths. Why is that? Why is it that we remember such things but forget the so-called good stories, the good outcomes? They don't fit certain narratives, but they also come from a certain type of sources that were accessible, printed chronicles that began to disseminate these even one-liners, as I mentioned here. Not big stories, but one-liners that enter the sort of environment and of knowledge and epistemology of the era, and is transmitted and repeatedly transmitted through these type of sources. Here is another example of the story of Simon of Trent, that boy that was referenced by the shooter in San Diego, and that also enters chronicles. Here is the one with the image. So images amplify this story. But the chroniclers were not really interested in the stories of Jews' survival or acquittal. In fact, when we do have the cases where they are mentioned in other editions, that stories that Jews survive or were acquitted are missing. What is not missing, what is always transmitted, is this, that Jews were killed. So what happens is these stories are commemorated sometimes through art, like the print art, or like this very famous or infamous painting in the Polish town of Sandomierz, which has sort of a composite painting telling a story of several trials, that two really trials, but maybe three, that took place in that town in 17th and 18th century. It's a horrific painting and it still survives. But it's seen as the epitome of those stories. Jews, in fact, were killed at the end of these trials. But what I want to show you is that this very trial, which is now so prominent in public memory and in literature on anti-Semitism and on Polish-Jewish relations, was actually a story that didn't have the same impact, or had quite an opposite impact than what we read about today as the proof of anti-Jewish sentiments and anti-Semitism. So these are this is the number of trials, the map of the trials and efforts that, against Jews in Europe. From 1690, the trial in Sandomierz were 1698 and 1710. So these two trials in Sandomierz are right here. And you can see right after, the decades after this trial of Sandomierz, there are no additional trials. You can see these dots in Italy. They're unrelated. It's a totally different story. There is one that is mentioned that there's no other evidence. Sorry, I had a timer. I have 2 more minutes. But there is nothing for the subsequent decades. And yet this story looms large. The other one is the story of this image that was published in 1493, and again dropped into oblivion until the Nazis brought it back to life in 1934 in the Der Stürmer issue about blood libels and ritual murder accusations. And then it enters European vocabulary, iconographic vocabulary, and it's disseminated everywhere. And after the war, it also enters literature on anti-Semitism, but showing as if it was a proof of the medieval era, and academic literature. So I'm finishing now. What does it all tell us? I think that suffering, the important point is that suffering and anti-Semitism are only one facet of Jewish history, but one that is very attractive, both to anti-Semites. It proves that Jews could be and should be and are to be persecuted, and for Jews in the tradition of lachrymose history. The other stories don't fit those those narratives. We have to be aware of how these facts or fictions spread and become facts, and we are certainly now very much aware of that. And unfortunately, sometimes we scholars unwittingly amplify these anti-Jewish voices. So I would just say that we need to expand our ideas and vocabulary about Jewish history and historical experience, not to repeat those anti-Jewish language and tropes in order to understand better history and also counteract some of those anti-Jewish stereotypes. So I'll stop here.
All right, thank you very much, Magda. That was fascinating. Now I think I just have the honor of turning it to our two other panelists, Adam and Cherry, so take it away.
Thank you so much for having us today, and I know that Dr. Rabin and I are both thrilled to be here. And we were asked to talk about present-day uses of the Jewish past. And when I first heard that that request, I thought, this is going to be fun. And then, of course, the last week happened, and frankly, these issues matter. And so I just want to start with a few images, if this works. Let's hope it does. You guys see that okay? When we look at these images, you can see a bit of abuses, some of the abuses of historical memory. Last week, in what only can be described as an attempted coup, a terrorist act, a riot, if we're being nice, we saw numerous attempts to harken back to the past. The Camp Auschwitz shirt brings up memories of a Jewish past that is not so comforting. And you also had the 6 million were not enough shirt, which also includes fascist, literally a fasci at the bottom of it. It's a fascist symbol. But I want to focus on the image on the right, where you have this gentleman who's since been arrested, we learned today, walking through the US Capitol, having breached the US seat of government, carrying a Confederate flag. And behind him, John C. Calhoun looks on and staring daggers at John C. Calhoun. If you look right above the gentleman on the right is Charles Sumner. And this photo is just loaded with symbolism to the Civil War historian. Calhoun, of course, is the intellectual grandfather of secession. Sumner is a leading radical abolitionist who literally was caned on the Senate floor by a House member because he spoke out against slavery. And now a man seeking to silence Congress 164 years later, carrying the flag of the Confederacy through the US Capitol, we see. Now, mind you, this flag had never breached those doors despite repeated efforts by Robert E. Lee and his army 156 years earlier. And later that night, two congressmen almost came to blows once again. And so there are clearly some parallels we could look at, but there's also a hearkening back to the past. I mean, when he was carrying that flag through the Capitol, it would be interesting to ask him, did he realize the flag's historical use as a form of intimidation against civil rights for African American? Most likely he did, but if not, he was still hearkening back to a misremembered past, a past that remembered Confederate soldiers as heroes rather than traitors. And it's a remembrance of the Confederacy that frankly separated slavery and white supremacy, but ignores historical reality. And it's a memory very much alive in American society, and it's a memory that's very problematic. Historians often call this memory of the past the lost cause. And a memory of the Civil War, this memory of the Civil War was propagated by white Southerners to justify white supremacy during the Jim Crow era. And it was a false memory. While each individual, of course, has their own memory of what happened in the past, there are certain tenets that showed up again and again among white Southerners that were repeated and passed on generationally. And it's what's learned, right, from listening to your grandfather or listening to your parents. And I don't want to go into too much detail of what I call the false cause, because it is so much loaded with falsehood. And it supports white supremacy, which is a second false, the big lie, if you will. And the first is the myth that the war wasn't about slavery. And let's be very clear, it was. The war was all about slavery. But if you recall it as about states' rights, and you want to remember the war, if you will, and you didn't lose if you fought for states' rights, because we still have states' rights. Now, later it becomes a way of avoiding being condemned for slavery, but initially, and some still do, the lost cause advocates said slavery was benevolent, despite it being a terrible system of labor and of labor extraction premised on terror and violence, right? And murder, even. Now, a second myth was that every white Southerner supported the Confederacy and fought more valiantly than any soldier in history. Again, there's some problems with this myth. It ignores the role of desertion, conscription, dissent, and unionism in understanding the Civil War. Now, there are other myths that are part of what I call the false cause or the lost cause. I can't go into all of them today, but I discuss them more fully in the book, and we can talk about them in the Q&A if people have questions. But as soon as the war ended, this myth began being propagated by white Southerners. In fact, Edward Pollard in 1866 really kind of coins the phrase with the publication of his book. And these narratives of history began spreading and evolving. And Jews played a part in that. And I'm going to pass that on now to Sherry to take over.
Okay, thank you, Adam. So Jews, although a tiny population in the South and indeed in the US in this period, also began to contribute to the lost cause narrative as soon as the Civil War ended. Already in 1865, Louis Leon, who was a New York native serving in the Confederate Army, wrote in his diary, quote, "Our cause is lost, but I will say our cause was just." In the decades to follow, some Jews, like Perry Moses of Sumter, South Carolina, became avid participants in Confederate Veterans Group. And Perry's here on the right with his two brothers. There were 5 of them altogether who served in the Confederate Army, and one of them was killed in action. Moses Ezekiel, another Confederate veteran, became a sculptor after the war, specializing in biblical and patriotic themes. His creations include this bust of Robert E. Lee on the left from 1886, which was recently removed from the campus of Virginia Military Institute, which Ezekiel had attended, and an extremely problematic Confederate memorial for Arlington National Cemetery from 1914, which still stands, although Ezekiel's own descendants have called for its removal. The politics of Jewish Civil War memory have led many to focus on the Jewish Confederates, like these men, and especially on Judah P. Benjamin, whose biographer described him as the Jewish Confederate. Born to Jewish parents in the Caribbean, in life, Benjamin married a Christian woman and largely avoided Jewish affiliation. He was an enslaver who rose to the rank of Secretary of State of the Confederacy. And yet in death, many Jews eagerly reclaimed and celebrated him. In 1902, a rabbi in Richmond wrote, "He was a hero, a statesman, a gentleman, and a patriot, and we claim the privilege of sharing in the reflection of his glory." Jews described him as Jefferson Davis's right-hand man with pride and the brains of the Confederacy. And in 1948, the Jewish Publication Society of America published this children's book about him, Mr. Benjamin's Sword. They chose not only to publish it in 1948, but to reprint it in 1954, which was the year where American Jews were celebrating the 300th anniversary of Jewish settlement in what would become the United States. That same year, the Jewish war veterans met in Atlanta and gave a portrait of Judah P. Benjamin to the mayor of the city of Atlanta, Mayor Hartsfield. They published yet another printing of Mr. Benjamin's sword in 1962, just 4 years after a group that called itself the Confederate Underground bombed the temple, the oldest synagogue in Atlanta. Benjamin was the inspiration for various monuments, including a number erected by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. One of these monuments, erected in Charlotte in 1948, was funded by 2 synagogues. Much more recently and further afield geographically, in the early 2000s, Benjamin's name was placed on a window of historic Jewish notables inside of a California synagogue's religious school building. Somewhat bizarrely, Benjamin was sandwiched in between Vladimir Jabotinsky, the radical revisionist Zionist, and Alan Greenspan, the former Federal Reserve Chairman. In the past year, both of these sort of commemorative objects were removed. These recent critiques of pro-Confederate public memory are really important and necessary, but we would argue that they should really only be the beginning, not the end of our efforts to understand the history of the Civil War and its long shadow in American Jewish life. In the 150 years since the end of the Civil War, there have been multiple Jewish memories other than the Lost Cause, and multiple media of memorialization other than protests and children's books, speeches, and statues. So I'm going back now to Adam.
All right, thank you so much. And I really think this is great because this really dovetails nicely with our first speaker, because it is a larger story when we're talking about Jews in the Civil War. And I want to use one man to give us an example of another form of memory. And this man is one that Sherry and I have been working on for a while. His name is Simon Gerstmann. And I should be able to see a picture of him now if I shared screen correctly. Gerstmann was a Jew born in 1833 in the Russian Empire, but he immigrated to the US in 1854, where he promptly enlisted in the US Army. Spent 5 years in the 2nd US Artillery, was stationed in Florida during the Seminole War, the Third Seminole War. He began naturalization proceedings in 1857, and by 1859 was a citizen of the United States. He left the Army in 1859 and soon moved to Savannah just in time for the Civil War to begin. And during the war, Gerstmann actually sought to avoid military service. You might think a veteran, he'd be quick to enlist. He's not. He instead, and we have an article coming out about this in the Journal of Southern History later this year. But I want to give you a quick rundown on him, sort of what he did. He constantly avoided service during the Civil War by claiming an exemption from conscription based on being a religious leader. And he said that he was the religious leader for his synagogue, and there's some question over whether this is true or not, or he was just saying it so he could avoid service. And he would claim later that his leadership was not sincere, but actually based on a desire to avoid military service. So he himself would claim that he had done this to avoid service. And in the immediate aftermath of the war, the reason we know this is a series of documents. Gerstmann successfully brought a lawsuit against the United States government for cotton seized by the US Army during the Civil War. Now, I need to explain a little bit of how this works. So any property taken during war is forfeit, right? So if you were a Confederate and your property's taken, tough luck. But if you were a Unionist and you could prove you were a Unionist, any property taken by the Union Army for the war efforts could theoretically get reimbursed for. Now, the trick to this is you had to prove that you would remain loyal the entire war and that the property was taken by the Army. And there's sort of 3 ways to do this that we look at. One is in the 1860s, which is the Court of Claims, cotton claims. If people had cotton taken, they could bring a claim. One was in the 1870s, where a special commission called the Southern Claims Commission was set up to hear these cases and heard thousands of these cases. And one was the Court of Claims again started taking these cases back after the Southern Claims Commission was disbanded. If you wanted to appeal your finding there, you could appeal it to the Court of Claims again. Into the 20th century, some of these claims go. And so what happens is Gerstmann files a claim for cotton. He files a claim for property taken from his general store that he ran with the Southern Claims Commission in the 1870s. And then he appeals when that case is denied into the 1890s. And in fact, the case is ongoing when he dies in the 1890s. So Gerstmann becomes one of these rare claimants, and he testifies 3 times about his unionism in 3 different decades. And what we can find in this, and he was found both loyal and disloyal at various times, though decades apart. And each time he testifies, he presents a different narrative of the war than the lost cause, and a unique memory of the war that actually countered the lost cause. Instead of claiming to be a loyal Confederate, Gerstmann and numerous other Savannah Jews, he's not alone in this. We found numerous others, and we have some leads. Do we think there's some more? We still need to do some more research. That remained loyal, or at least claimed they did. And despite this, historians of Southern Jews during the Civil War have largely focused on Jews who served in the Confederate Army. And if Gerstmann is to be believed, his entire congregation opposed the Confederacy. Now, this stands in stark contrast to one author's claim that Southern Jewry almost unanimously cast its lot with the Confederate States of America. Gerstmann recounted how he garnered deferment, how he aided others in avoiding Confederate service, how he provided aid to prisoners of war held in Savannah. And what's really funny is when you look at these testimonies, they sort of evolve. But he's presenting a specific counter narrative that proclaimed many white Southerners opposed the Confederacy. And of course, this memory doesn't last. The lost cause sort of replaces it. But Simon Gerstmann publicly recalled resisting the Confederacy again and again, and we find these in court records. And so despite this, he's been largely forgotten, despite the fact that during the 19th century, he really becomes sort of a Forrest Gump-like character of the 19th century. He keeps popping up at key moments in the background, if you will. To give you a taste, he's there for the end of Reconstruction in Georgia. He has an involvement in a court case. He has a tiny bit of part to play in the whiskey ring scandal. He testifies before Congress on an electioneering case. Oh, and he's a founding member of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, now known as the Union for Reform Judaism. So he's sort of popping up here and there in various moments in history. But if we look at his claims, one of the things that's really interesting is that as he's making these claims, they begin to grow. It's sort of like the story of the fish, right? The first time I helped a Jewish officer who was captured and in Savannah. And by the end, he's claiming he drove a wagon of food across Georgia to Andersonville to feed Union prisoners who were starving. Now, there's little doubt that at times Gerstmann exaggerated how he supported the Union in the years after the war. And Sherry and I have great debates about exactly when we're supposed to trust him and when we're not, which is lots of fun. And it's an ongoing thing. But it's clear he wasn't lying about his avoiding of conscription. He really wanted to avoid conscription. And he wasn't the only one making these claims. And these were publicly known things, right? They published the list of claimants. And so though the details of the story might change or have been lost and not be known publicly because they're in these, court documents, the fact that he was claiming to be a unionist was known in Savannah. And the fact that numerous other members were similarly claiming to be unionists was known. And they're ultimately forgotten, though, again. And one fascinating aspect about Gerstmann is that while Jewish newspapers have helped us recover his life, the vast majority of our evidence doesn't come from the traditional Jewish sources that Jewish studies scholars often look at. Indeed, I'm trained as a Civil War historian, not a religious historian, which is why Dr. Raven and I work together on this project. But one thing Gerstmann shows us, I think, is that Jewish studies can find a whole slew of evidence from sources like official state records, claims against the government, secular newspapers, pension records we have, all provide insights into Jewish history and memory. And indeed, if there's one thing I've learned in the past few years as we work on this project, is that interdisciplinary collaboration is a really productive way to get at what happened in the past. And I'm going to hand it back to Sherry to wrap it up.
Great. So in his farewell address to the Senate in 1861 on the eve of war, Judah Benjamin argued that history shall pass her stern sentence on his opponents. Benjamin, I don't think, could have predicted the vagaries of his own memorialization, but it was clear already that early that the memory of Southern secession would be central to the formation of American identities. There are some defenders of Benjamin to this day and of the lost cause, as Adam's work shows. Memorials to Judah P. Benjamin still stand, and there is even still a lost cause memory that persists among a small number of Jews. I have personally seen a Confederate flag yarmulke, and know of a Jewish Charlestonian described in Sue Eisenfeld's recent travelogue called Wandering Dixie, a Charlestonian who hosts an annual birthday party for Robert E. Lee. We've begun to see some more forceful rejections of this kind of memory by some Americans and many American Jews, but not always a recognition of the counter narratives or alternative memories of the Civil War. For instance, we don't know a ton about African-American memory of the Civil War, and understandings of Jewish memory of the Civil War are mostly limited to kind of the lost cause and efforts to tie Jews to Abraham Lincoln. Almost no one remembers Simon Gerstmann or the strain of Jewish unionism that he assiduously recorded for almost 30 years. And this is maybe for a good reason. Simon Gerstmann is a tricky figure that Adam and I debate about. He was not always truthful. The sincerity of his unionist convictions is uncertain. And some of his post-war activities amounted to fraud. Self-interest was certainly never far from his mind. But there are also broader reasons that he and the memory he advanced have been forgotten. It's certainly true that in the US, history has served as the faith of the fallen Jew in Yosef Yerushalmi's famous phrase. And I'm amazed that I'm the first one to raise Yerushalmi in this context. Historians have focused perhaps most extensively on how American Jews have remembered the Holocaust and the Eastern European Jewish past. But as Jews faced outward to argue for their belonging and faced inward to foster Jewish pride, narratives of American Jewish history were also very important. This project became especially important around the turn of the 20th century and the period of mass migration, which is the same period in which much Civil War memory was forged and kind of reached its peak power. The American Jewish Historical Society was founded in 1892, and in 1904, American Jews first mobilized to commemorate the 1654 arrival of Jews to New Amsterdam. In 1895, a man named Simon Wolf published a book called The American Jew as Patriot, Soldier, and Citizen. The frontispiece here is a statue by none other than Confederate veteran Moses Ezekiel, tellingly called Religious Liberty. Wolf treated Confederate and Union military service as equally valid examples of patriotism, claiming that the Jew, while retaining his racial and religious distinctiveness, identifies himself with the people among whom he dwells. As Confederate service increasingly was accepted nationwide in this period as something noble rather than as evidence of disloyalty, unionism became less useful as a marker of identity. Gerstmann appears in Wolf's account for his antebellum military service, and he actually took part in the lively public debate that inspired the publication of this book. In response to accusations that Jews had failed to serve in the military, Gerstmann described himself as, quote, a Jew who served to protect the glorious flag, united now never to be torn asunder, under which we all live and enjoy its liberties. Gerstmann was at the time still arguing before the Court of Claims, but he, like so many others in this period, also worked to craft a vision of the American Jewish past in which Jews had enjoyed the exceptional blessings of religious freedom and in return made exemplary contributions to American civil and military endeavors. This narrative remained influential into the 20th and 21st centuries, including in relationship to the Civil War. Jews who nurture the lost cause celebrate Jewish military bravery, which they understand to have been in defense not of white supremacy or slavery, but of a region that they argue was in fact more welcoming of Jews than was the North. Judah Benjamin can be kind of squeezed into this narrative, but Gerstmann's story is a much tougher fit. His is not a story of stable religious freedom or valiant military service. Gerstmann brought his Judaism before representatives of the state, first to gain a military exemption and later to prove his loyalty. But what he experienced was in fact a battle for legibility against subtle forms of Christian dominance and overt forms of anti-Semitism. For instance, the Southern Claims Commission grilled him about the nature of the prayer for the government that he had recited during the war in his synagogue. When Gerstmann did win particular gains, it was as often the result of ignorance or confusion about Judaism as it was kind of a noble principle of religious freedom. And while Gerstmann did serve in the military in the 1850s, during the Civil War, he undertook extensive efforts to stay out of the military. And he played this up in his accounts before the court, even though it played into the kind of long-running anti-Semitic narratives about Jewish disloyalty that Simon Wolf's book would try to contest. So one could imagine a counter narrative where Gerstmann and the other Jews who avoided Confederate service are remembered as American patriots, Jewish advocates, or noble opponents of the Confederate cause. This kind of memory has never emerged, however, and we would also not encourage it. To present them in this way would distort the complexity of the facts on the ground and risk whitewashing the very real and disturbing history of Jewish complicity with the Confederacy, slavery, and white supremacy. We would argue, though, that Gerstmann is worth remembering, not because he's a heroic role model, but because of what he can teach us about how we remember. The fact that he remembered in pursuit of monetary reward and that his memories changed over time puts a fine point on something that is also true in public pageants or monuments. Memory is always goal-oriented and strategic. It is about the present. A unionist memory was useful to men like Gerstmann engaged in legal struggles, struggles that ended upon their death around the turn of the 20th century. The lost cause memory, however, has never ceased to be useful to white supremacists engaged in our nation's ongoing political struggles. For American Jews, the memory of the Civil War has been inexorably shaped by the overwhelming urge to prove Jewish belonging in America. This is why Benjamin has seemed appealing to some, even though, one, he was in fact a traitor to the United States, and two, many Southerners at the time were just as uncertain about the Confederate cause as Gerstmann was. As historians, we cannot predict or prescribe what memories will prove useful moving forward, but we can do our part to move past inherited narratives and blinkered hero worship to try to unearth the complexity of the past and the dynamics of what gets remembered, and more importantly, why. Thank you.
Great. So I guess now face the heavy challenge of asking some probing questions about these fascinating presentations. I think I have a million possible questions, but I was wisely limited by the powers that be to 5 minutes or so. So I'll try to be as concise as I possibly can. Maybe I'll start just by order. Magda, I'll start with you if that's okay. There are many things that I was very curious about in what you presented, but one thing that struck me in this might just be reflection, quite obviously, of coming from Israel, is that the especially your concluding remarks about the need to kind of step away from a very monolithic view of Jewish history as mired in the kind of constant tears, shall we put it. This was something that the conversation about that conception of Jewish history was a very dominant theme in Israeli discourse all the way to, well, the pre-state years and following in some ways to this day, with quite radical shifts in the period that I'm pretty sure that many of the things I'll say now, probably all of them, you're very familiar with. I'll just give a tiny bit of background for the sake of folks who kindly join us who might be a bit less familiar. And especially now, since David is indicating to me that I have a bit more time to ask my questions. So basically, obviously, as with everything else in politics, especially Israeli politics, everything I'm going to say here is controversial. It's just one view, but I think it's widely regarded as a plausible view. Much of the kind of formative ethos of Zionism as a political movement was the idea of the creation of a new Jew who will be consciously distinct from the old Jew, and consciously distinct in that, I'm going to put it somewhat teasingly, this will no longer be the oi 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 kind of Jew, right? That was the time of the diaspora. What these, quote unquote, these people did all the time was moan about the miseries of their existence. And we, the new Jews, are going to be radically and consciously different from that in anything from our appearance to our ways of being, of course, the willingness, in some cases, even the desire to step up and fight, and so on and so forth. This persisted, arguably, depending on how you view the situation, all the way easily until maybe the 1970s or 80s, where there starts a kind of re-examination of this ethos and the questions about whether it's unfair, perhaps even grossly unjust towards centuries or millennia of Jewish history, and it's monolithic and dangerous in its own ways, obviously not as aggressive and venomous as kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric, but in some complicated ways internalizing some of these stereotypes and turning them in very destructive directions. So that, of course, that long spiel I just gave wasn't much of a question. It was just a kind of background for folks who are a bit less familiar. So I suppose one of my reactions was just, especially towards the end of your presentation, just this kind of urge to, I guess, hear you say more about how you view these kind of debates. And to my, as far as I can tell, these things are still ongoing, at least in Israel, you know, up to the present and really as we speak. So there is a revival of you know, Yiddish theater that used to be regarded as an oi 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 experience, and now it's retro, it's chic. The cool people want to be part of it. And so in some sense, it's a very lively kind of cultural and political debate. And I guess I just wanted to draw you out, not of course in any manner of disagreement with anything you said, just kind of extending the scope a bit more. If it's okay, I'll also kind of flag my questions for Adam and Sherry very, very briefly. This is equally fascinating, and I'm equally ignorant of many of the minute details here. So please forgive any ignorance I'll display in my questions. I guess some of my questions were kind of basic orientation maybe this was already mentioned in one of your comments, and I somehow managed to miss it, but it wasn't entirely clear to me. For instance, how large was the Jewish community in the South in the war period, or even maybe more specifically in the area where your main protagonist / antagonist resided? And so related to that, when he's talking about, look, my congregation opposed the Southern cause, what portion of the relevant population is that remotely pretending to approximate even, right? So even if he was speaking the truth, however self-servingly, is that an indication of something that's really kind of fundamental, or maybe an exception that attests to the rule? Another question from maybe a slightly different direction was, I'm just curious, was there an extended body of commentary on the part of American Jews in the North, either during the war or shortly thereafter, who had any kind of sustained reflections on Jews in the South and how they behaved during the war? Because that seemed especially apt, and again, this comes from perspective of ignorance. I'm just really curiosity more than anything. Was there perhaps something, especially for American Jews in the North, who regarded any kind of fairly obvious tensions between the supposed causes of racial supremacy that the Confederacy fought for, and the Jewish experience is especially infuriating somehow, or how did they view those issues? So I've jotted down a bunch of other thoughts here, but I've spoken long enough, so I may just kind of jump back in with clarifications and follow-ups and so on, and I'll just I really let you, in any order you want to comment.
I guess I'll start, since that was the order. You raised some interesting points, and about the narrative, and that's two points that I want to say. The narrative of suffering, you're right, was something that fed into the Zionist cause. It was a narrative that also fed into the diasporist and emancipationist sort of cause of improvement, right? Which goes from that Enlightenment idea of progress, that history gets better. So the fact that the majority of the stories or cases are in fact in the 18th century, in that period, didn't fit the narrative. The fact the majority of the cases Jews were not persecuted also doesn't fit the story. As I mentioned, running through, for Jews, it doesn't fit the lachrymose history. And these Christian chronicles served Jews to compose dirges about martyrs and chronicles that commemorated their own martyrdom. Stories about successful trials of Jews acquitted did not feed that memory and did not fit that memory. For anti-Jewish writers, saying that Jews were acquitted totally negates the whole story that Jews always do it, that Jews always kill children, and that Jews are these cruel enemies of Christians. So that's why it becomes so ingrained, both in the modern period with modern historiographies, and in the pre-modern period in both Jewish and Christian collective memory about Jews. And I argue, and I'm not the only one, but that this is a dangerous way of thinking about Jews, and that vocabulary of repeating the language of Jewish persecution actually amplifies anti-Semitic tropes. And I'll just give you an example quickly of the current uses of the blood libel that again are amplified in this way. So we have here a cartoon from the Middle East, and clearly is drawing on that iconography from the pre-modern era. Here you have a Facebook page which is now taken down that attracts white supremacists. Here is a tomb of one of the supposed boys that attracts white supremacists. And just last year, there was a whole brouhaha over the painting of Simon of Trent. So that pre-modern past is very much modern, used and abused in the past. And when we amplify, as I've been noticing in the pandemic coverage, especially in Jewish press, but not only in Jewish press, the fact that Jews have always been attacked, persecuted, accused, and of those things, we are limited the vocabulary about Jewish history, and we're limiting the vocabulary of Jewish historical experience, and we're essentially legitimizing attacks against Jews. We're legitimizing that's all has always happened. That's historically has always happened. That's all can be done. That's the way Jews are. So in some way, if we're looking for the uses of Jewish past, the more accurate representation of Jewish history as more integral and integrated into society, as much less isolated, much less persecuted, is actually serving to fight anti-Semitism. And that was Salo Baron, and that was Cecil Roth, who focused on that. And they were doing it to fight anti-Semitism. They were not, they were fighting lachrymose history in order to fight also anti-Semitism. I'll stop here.
Thank you.
Yeah, so just to like, it's interesting hearing you talk, Magda. I think if this sort of like history of anti-Semitism gets linked to the medieval period, I think it also gets linked to Europe in a certain way. So you see that, like Schmule was talking about, how a lot of Zionist narratives are about sort of creating a dichotomy between Israel and Europe. And I think in the US versus Europe also, right, there's these exceptionalisms
That's right.
that play into some of these narratives you're talking about. So to the question of what did Northern Jews say about the South? So it's actually interesting, the only rabbis who really spoke like from a sort of rabbinic place about slavery at all was after secession. It was in the early part of 1861, and it was in the North. And there was a famous rabbi in New York who comes out saying that the Bible does sanction slavery. And then there are a couple rabbis who oppose that view. And one of those men, I just found this quote recently, and it's fascinating to me. And he was a Chicago rabbi, Bernhard Felsenthal, and he wrote around this time of Southern Jews, in their hearts they impatiently yearn for the time when the awful rebellion of the aristocrats of the South with crushed heads will be down on the ground. So he's imagining like, oh, there's no way that they're really on board with this. Like they're probably just like grinning and bearing it. Which you can see, right, that he's trying to sort of maintain some sense of commonality even in the midst of this kind of dramatic split. In terms of the Jewish community size in this period, it's really hard to get like detailed or accurate data from this period, but the general guesstimate for the broader population of Jews in the US in 1860 is 150,000. And by this point already the population was larger in the North than in the South, for sure. So small Jewish communities in the South, but long established and visible in particular cities, like in Savannah, where Jews were amongst the earliest settlers in the 1730s. So when he's talking, and there were two congregations, his congregation is the second congregation in Savannah. So there's, enough of a community. But when he's talking about his congregation avoiding military service, it's not a huge group of people. And at one point later on, he admits, well, and actually like a lot of them were too old anyways. But earlier on, he says like, oh, none of us served. And then come to find out it's because some of them were ineligible. So yeah.
I had a couple small follow-ups on that, but Adam, do you want to step in?
Yeah, I wanted to just finish off that question, if that's okay, about the extent of unionism, I guess, is how many of them sort of would have supported the United States. And there's a lot of debate and there was a lot of debate at the time of the extent of dissent, as I call it, anti-Confederate dissent. But it is something that has been largely papered over and largely ignored. And we don't have a good estimate on Jews specifically, but we can speak more generally about Southerners. And I think that my guess is probably that it's not dissimilar numbers, right? And part of it has a lot to do with where you are. But I think we should start when we talk about Southerners, and we're saying that there are Southerners who oppose the Confederacy. We need to recognize that there are 4 million Southerners who are opposing the Confederacy from the start of the war, and those are enslaved Southerners, right? When Southerners includes both Black Southerners and white Southerners. Now, when we turn to white Southerners, though, we should recognize that a lot of them do join the U.S. Army is one way to measure it. And if we look at that, we know that somewhere in the order of 100,000, if I remember correctly, white Southerners join the U.S. Army, which, if you do the math on that, is bigger than the entire Army of Northern Virginia, which is Robert E. Lee's army. So that's a massive shift in manpower that could have swung the war, one might argue, had the South been as loyal as it's presented by the Lost Cause. And so we don't know yet the extent of Jewish descent, but we do know there's ample descent in various regions. North Carolina is notorious for it. The Appalachian Mountains are notorious. West Virginia, of course, breaks off from Virginia. But there's also descent in the coastal areas. You even find individuals who later say that they're Unionists or clearly were Unionists in the coastal Carolina area. Not all of them necessarily were abolitionists, to be clear, either. We should be clear on this. They were, many of them were probably anti-conscription as much as they were anti-Confederate. They wanted to avoid service. So, they might have gone along with it for a year, and then in 1862, when conscription begins, they stop being interested. So hopefully that answers the question.
It does. I did want to follow up though. So when you said, for instance, 100,000 white Southerners who basically enlisted with the Union, what portion is that of whatever matrix you want to use, fighting age white Southerners?
So to give you an idea, that's a good question. I'd have to look at the numbers again off the top of my head. I think the easiest metric for most people to recognize is that it's literally bigger than the largest Confederate force at any time in the war. The Confederate Army the Confederacy has multiple armies, and none of those armies, the Army of Northern Virginia, there's an army out in Tennessee, there's an army out in various places, and none of these forces are ever more than 100,000. So it would have given them another force of magnitude. It's somewhere in the order of, there's about 1 million men in arms by the end of the war for the United States. So
we're talking about at least 10%. That's a pretty a pretty substantial portion. 5 to
10%. And when you know that there's 180,000 African Americans, roughly somewhere between 150 and 200,000 Black Southerners who enlist in the United States military, you're looking at a substantial movement of labor and troops that are now suddenly in the U.S. military. And so, these are substantial amounts of forces. This would make a major difference if they had it. And you also have dissenters who don't serve in either force. Guys like Gerstmann, right? Gerstmann doesn't serve in either force, so he's not counted in that. And you have individuals who run away. There's one of the other religious leaders of this congregation that we're looking at. His son sneaks away to Florida and then basically rows out to a Union gunboat and gets on a U.S. Navy ship and sails north and avoids service. He doesn't serve in either force, right? So he's not counted in that. And then there's people who hide in the bushes, right? You have the sort of the bushwhackers and the deserters who literally fight a war. By the end of the war, Western North Carolina and Central North Carolina are just riddled with armed bands who are basically resisting conscription. And so it's massive. It massively undermines to the point where in the midst of the siege of Petersburg, the last major battle that Lee fights, they're having to send troops to North Carolina to suppress dissenters.
Magda, you wanted to comment on this?
I just wanted to make a comment on your responses and your presentations. One of the things that is fascinating to me, which we historians often forget by going to the archives, and I've been, showing you the archival materials that challenge certain stereotypes. But one of the things is the popular literature, and Sherry, you brought it up at what people were reading, and the monuments, the sort of landmarks that establish false facts, but established facts on the ground at some level, and people go, and whether it's street names, whether it's a church and church art, or whether it's statues and cemeteries and so on and so forth. So I wonder whether we can talk about the role of those popular media that are accessible in shaping the popular memory, but also in making our lives difficult by entrenching these kinds of false memories and false stereotypes.
I mean, yeah, if I can reply to that, I think it's massively important. The United Daughters of the Confederacy is a great example of this, and that they basically wage a campaign to control what goes in textbooks for decades, and they're successful. There's a great book by Karen Cox called Dixie's Daughters that looks at their campaign to basically control what's taught, not only in the South, but nationwide about the Civil War. And they literally have this campaign where they want to stamp any book that isn't friendly to the South with literally a stamp that says unfriendly to the South in it, so that like people know that they shouldn't read this book.
Does it literally say unfriendly to the
literally, they
South?
call for using a stamp at public libraries to let people know, like, don't read this book. I mean, it's what, or don't buy, and they also push against buying these books. I mean, they're very much about controlling, because they know that the message that they're sending, that this narrative is problematic. They know there's an alternative counter memory, right? Otherwise, you don't try to control things. If you think everyone agrees with you, there's no reason to control this memory. So they know there's this alternative memory out there that they're pushing back against. But yeah, it's wildly successful. And ultimately, many Northerners begin accepting aspects of the lost cause. And this issue of, for instance, the cause of the war, whether it's slavery. I mean, these people knew the war was about slavery. I mean, you can read their letters from during the war and before the war, and it's very clear. And then they shifted after the war. And even occasionally you'll catch them sort of admitting it. Even, 1 week they're going to give a speech where they admit it's slavery, and the next they're saying it's not, depending on who the audience is. I mean, they literally know that they're changing what they say for their audience. And so, I mean, one of the things that I think memory studies, and I've been pushing for, and this is what I think is the most important part of my own work methodologically, is looking at lies. Is that memory, traditionally we think about what's remembered, what's forgotten, and that makes up memory, right? That's how scholars approach historical memory, especially in the US. And I think there's this third element of what's just made up that we need to talk more about. So I hope that answers your question. But yeah, it's very much.
Great. There's much more that I can say, though I'm looking at the time now, and I suspect that David will be coming in any moment to put things in the broader context. There he is.
Well, so on cue, I will jump in to present some of the questions that have been coming in from our audience members, but also to encourage our audience members to please continue sending in any questions that you have. We want to make sure that in addition to the really stimulating conversation we've been hearing from among our panelists, that we have the opportunity to address questions that come out of the crowd. So maybe I'll start by reading to you some pieces of one of the early questions that came in, which I think is addressed to Adam and to Sherry, but I suspect would have implications for Magda as well. And the question is, what is the likelihood that while top leadership of the Confederacy fought the Civil War over slavery, which Adam, you made very abundantly clear, others in the Confederacy, and I think here we could include potentially Jews living in the Confederacy, truly believed that the cause was states' rights, or maybe something else, and didn't attempt to sanitize history, but were actually expressing their true beliefs. And our questioner said that they think about this question in light, especially of last week, given their suspicions that there were any number of groups at the Capitol who were there for reasons other than, Confederate insurrection.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, it's the classic question, right? When you know what causes a war, but what makes someone fight in it might be different. And I think there's something to be said here, right? If why does an 18-year-old go off to war? Well, they're excited about the chance to go off to war and to leave whatever town they've lived in their whole life. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why people enlist. That being said, people knew what the war was about. It's published. It's in the newspapers. It's in the Articles of Secession. Nobody's going around in 1860 saying, we're doing this because states' rights is a really important principle. And if we don't do this, it's going to be about your tax rate. I mean, there's no income tax yet. Income tax starts during the Civil War. If you're a person, living in rural Georgia, let's say, or just living really anyways, your interaction with the federal government is minuscule. It's the post office and the census taker every decade. That's about it. It's not till the sort of infrastructure of the federal state doesn't exist yet in the sense that we experience it today. And so the idea that this was about states' rights, they're pretty clear. In fact, if you read the Articles of Secession of South Carolina, they're actually explicitly complain that New York's ideas of states' rights are too strict, and that they won't enforce federal law, the Fugitive Slave Act. And so there's a really great book by Colin Woodward that looks at the views of soldiers. And one of the things he finds is that actually commitment to the Confederate cause increases with the Emancipation Proclamation. When that happens, white Southerners become more committed to the Confederacy, not less, not surprisingly. And so when it becomes it's very apparent that, you know, for a poor white Southerner, their aspiration is often still to own enslaved people. I mean, that may be, it doesn't require you to own someone to want to maintain slavery. And slavery ensured that even the lowest white was not at the bottom of the social ladder. I mean, there's a certain level in which, when you think about it psychologically, what it's doing for people, it very much had a purpose. And in the same ways that white supremacy to this day harms whites as well, right? I mean, the way that white supremacy impacts our healthcare system and support for things like access to healthcare is very clearly harmful to whites as well as African Americans. Yes, it harms African Americans more, but it's not new for white supremacy to help motivate people to shoot themselves in their own foot, so to speak, or to do something outside their own self-economic interests. And so I think they knew what the war was about. And the last thing I would add, just to sum this up, is when we start looking at the memory side, post-war, the people who are pushing the lost cause narrative the most, the people who are really funding the monuments, and they tend to be wealthier Southerners, which means that they probably come from slaveholding families. I mean, Julian Carr, who's the one I spend the most time on in my book, very much came from a slaveholding family. In fact, he has a half brother who was enslaved and fathered by his own father. And so there's a whole side story there with Julian Carr. So I think there's a lot to say, but I think the answer of, did they know it was about slavery? They knew it was about slavery. Nobody was pretending it wasn't. If that's why individuals fought, is a separate question.
I want to sort of address the other part of about belief in what people, so aside from the Civil War, whether people act on belief. And of course, as the questioner asked about referring to our events in our time, I think that ties much more closely to my material, because in my case, these were false, fake stories, really fake news stories, sometimes promoted, in fact, by the media, by the printing press rapidly to spread them. But it is the source of knowledge that determined whether people believe in it, right? It's not that there was no counter story. It's not that there were, the Pope in 1247 said that Jews don't do it. Don't accuse Jews of such things, they don't do it. It's not like it was a hidden knowledge, it was out there. But this is not what was disseminated, and therefore, because it was disseminated through the sources that people considered authoritative sources of knowledge, like people today turn to whatever they consider authoritative sources of knowledge, they act upon those sources of knowledge. So they truly believed that Jews did it. I mean, some, were using it for political reasons, but many believe that they did it. So when a child popped up, dead somewhere, it was a kind of for me, one of the discoveries, eureka moments, if I had one writing this book, was, why are we asking the question, why did they believe it? Why we should be asking, why didn't they believe it? It's actually the opposite that is true, because whatever was available for you as a European reader, and I stress reader, the people who had contact with Jews did not hold those beliefs. It was the educated ones. Another sort of narrative that comes up now about the rabble, a mob. This is also an Enlightenment era myth, because it tries to sort of push away the responsibility of the educated. But it was an educated myth, educated lie. and that was what was important, that that what they read, what you could read as a literate European, you'd find these stories. So why do, as one of my characters said, who do you believe, the rabbi or the fathers of the church? And you believe who you believe.
Yeah, and I think this is such an interesting kind of methodological question too, right? Like, we only have the sources that we have to look at, right? We can barely know what's kind of deep inside the heart and mind of like other human beings in our own time, and trying to sort of, I think about that a lot, like trying to think about this question about this, like, what did people believe? Like, we can't really get at that question easily. We can know what they wrote, and we can understand the context in which they were operating, and that's kind of the best we can do. But I something I kind of wanted to raise that I've been thinking about, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about this, Magda, is in the events of last week, and I think also something we see a lot in our materials, is the sort of question of masculinity, in thinking about sort of what are the appeal of these particular narratives, why do they persist? And looking at these accounts of Judah Benjamin, like I think that really plays into it, and this effort to sort of show that American Jews are kind of the manly soldier, like statesman types, I think it is a real draw. So I'd be curious, Magda, how sort of gender masculinity stuff plays into your material.
I think Schmule, with his Israeli background, is the person to say, but no, there is this, certainly in modern times, that myth of the incapable Jew, and it's part of the citizenship debates, whether Jews can be citizens, and the argument is no, they can't, because they won't be able to serve in the army, right? And of course then there is the proof, and then you have with the Dreyfus affair a Jew who is serving in the army, who is then accused of espionage and disloyalty. So it all comes in crashing, right? So there is definitely that in Jewish historiography that need to affirm their belonging as citizens, and whatever that idea of citizenship meant in the South at the time, and certainly Benjamin is part of that ethos, or other aspects of citizenship, whether in Europe or in northern states. So it's definitely part of that story. And men were citizens, right? Men, full citizenship was for men, white, and in Europe Christian men. So Jewish men had to sort of affirm their masculinity and belonging, and this, deserving to be the citizens.
Excuse me.
It's interesting that like the Benjamin and the story that we're telling is kind of about memory of a sort of idealized past in a way, and your story is the sort of opposite, right? So both of those things kind of operating in interesting ways.
Oh, my apologies for an ill-timed cough, but I do want to encourage our audience members to add questions if they would like to. And since I'm an audience member, maybe I can ask a question as well while people are processing their questions. So Magda, I know that you showed some images and you touched briefly on this case in Poland in Sandomierz. What you didn't mention, and what I'm sure our audience would be fascinated to learn about, is that there have been discussions there about how that commemoration, how that artwork should or should not be preserved. And I know you were involved in those discussions. You've written about them a little bit. These are sort of, the stakes of what to do with public history are so obvious maybe to us as Americans now as they relate, Sherry and Adam, to your material. But Magda, what can we learn from the case study that you've worked on in terms of how blood libel imagery is treated, especially in Poland, which people may know right now has its own very complicated discussions about memory of the Shoah and its role in Jewish history.
And that there are relatively few images compared to Italy and Germany. There are relatively few images that were either in print. There are almost none, very few that are printed of that imagery in Poland. and very few were in churches. Most of them have been destroyed. This particular image that I showed survived. And that's another thing that's interesting, that it didn't really draw attention at all until Jewish Christian, Jewish Polish, Jewish Christian dialogue started really taking off in the 1990s. And only then did that painting become a sort of a moment of contention and conflict that led to decades-long stalemate. The painting is part of a larger series of a total of 16 paintings in the local cathedral, and sort of highlighting the martyrdom of Catholics, really, both local and of the church. And some, because it became such a horrible issue, finally the committee, Jewish Catholic committee, agreed on a plaque, but the local bishop didn't allow that. So the painting was covered up, leading to even more problems, because when you uncover it, what do you do with it, right? So there are all kinds of issues with that. And when I entered the scene, I wanted access to the archives for my book, and at that time I didn't know where the book was going, and I had a conversation with the bishop, and he said, you know, this painting is a big problem, and it was a big problem because the people of Sandomierz, because the painting became the symbol of Polish anti-Semitism, of everything that's wrong with Polish-Jewish relations, and of Polish Catholic Jewish relations. And so the present was so present in the past, and the past was so present in the present. So what we did, we worked on trying to understand that painting and the events in the context of the 18th century, what that meant in the 18th century. And unlike the statues of the Confederate generals and figures, which were made later to serve the lost cause narrative, this was actually done in the time, in the moment, just by this. It was commissioned by the person who was responsible for instigating the trial, the priest in the town. So we, and it had a much deeper history, tying the story, the seemingly local story, to the Simon of Trent narrative and to other narratives of the church. So when we did a conference where Sarah Lipton spoke on Jews and Christian art, I spoke on larger on Jewish Christian relations. Then there was a scholar of Polish art and church art, and we discussed it. It was the first time when the town was able to actually look at this painting and talk about the issue, because we divorced it from the present and the weight of the present and the accusations of the present. And we just try to understand it as this artifact of the 18th century, which has ramification to the present, but you first needed to understand what it meant before we can go and examine what it means now. And what happened was that allowed the painting to be unveiled because it was blocked by plywood, and a plaque in 3 languages is posted, in Polish, English, and Hebrew, about this painting, what it means, the history, sort of brief of church relations and the blood libel accusations. I would write the plaque slightly differently, but at least it does something. And I am of a torn kind of mind of it. On the one hand, removing it really is removing the responsibility. And some of the discussions about the memory of the Southern memory of the Confederation is arguing that we should not wipe it out clean, because that really wipes out the historical responsibility. It allows people to even whitewash the history even more. On the other hand, it is in a public place, so what does it do? And I think, again, if done properly, if it's described properly and contextualized as this 18th century piece is, it's not put in the 19th century and the 20th century to sort of glorify something, then it might be a useful model for the dialogue, reconciliation, and understanding that kind of complexity of it. And when I got the archival material, it was exactly what I said to the bishop. I said, listen, the archival materials will show that the situation was much more complex. And indeed it did. It was this, there was a faction that was against Jews, and there were also their defenders. But the story was muted, and only that painting was giving this only one story.
So if I could just mention here, I think this is a really interesting point about sort of a model for the South. I think one of the key things you've touched on, Magda, is the issue of location, right? Is this in a public space? Is this in a museum? Is this in a space that's meant to be interpreted? And I think that's one of the problems that we've struggled with in the American South, is that so many of these monuments that are causing the problems are in very public places and places of official commemoration. And so adding a plaque isn't enough, because if nobody's reading the plaque and it's the architecture of it forces you to look up to it, then it still has this place of power, right? And if you move it, then contextualization may work better. The other flip side, of course, of this is that you have to have some agreement on what the plaque says, right? And part of the problem is that we don't have a consensus by any means on what these plaques should say, right? If we've got a false history being perpetuated by these monuments, and some of them have, just ahistorical inscriptions on them. There's no other way to describe it except unhistorical. And the problem is some people defend those inscriptions. And so it becomes, I don't know how much you have people saying, no, the blood libel is real, would be, I think, the equivalent sort of issue to deal with. And I don't know if you have that issue at all, where people are saying, no, this really did happen.
I think, the Confederate monuments are, again, they were built in a very specific moment to serve a very specific role. And that's not necessarily, a it is a historical moment, but it is commemorating a certain cause.
Right, which is really about Jim Crow, I would argue, right?
Right,
when you really look at what monuments need to be contextualized, you need to talk about the Jim Crow. That's
right. It glorifies that. In this case, and again, I am torn on that. I could go either way. There was no plaque. It's this painting, along with others, of things being done, horrible things being done to other people, 18th century horrible art. In this case, I think the plaque could work, and the guides, local guides, tour guides could work. But that is a process, because the guides need to understand what the stakes are. And if they are vested in that defensive memory or defensiveness that was plaguing the town for so long, it's going to be a problem.
Yes.
So it's a very long process. But at the same time, if you remove this painting out of 16 and put it in a museum, then it at some level also amplifies it in a different way.
Yeah.
Right. So that's why I think the solution is okay, but there is no perfect solution for that type of art. I think it could work in a museum, but it could also work appropriately written. But again, this is not on a square,
right,
where you look it up. It's So.
And I would also say that I think, I'm guessing here, but the tourism industry of those towns, for instance, isn't based upon propagating the blood libel, right? It's
right.
It's a different.
Exactly.
A city like Charleston, where I live, there is there's a vested interest in remembering plantations in a Moonlight Magnolias method.
It besmirches the memory. They see themselves as this royal town, and why are people talking about it in this bad way, right? So it's a very different kind of a story.
And so, I think what you have here is it's a classic case of, with his history, when you're trying to make parallels it's key to understand the differences as well as the similarities to be able to learn from them, right? You've got to focus on both to really be able to draw out useful information. And I think that this is the sort of key here is I think these discussions of what is different is key to understanding and learning from other examples.
So unfortunately, we're coming up on the end of our time, and Sherry's cat has been waving to all of us that that our time is running out. Sherry, I do want to ask, though, if you want to have an opportunity for the last word to weigh in on this last bit of the conversation.
I enjoyed kind of sitting back and listening to this dialogue. I think having these moments for comparison and dialogue kind of across examples raises some really thought-provoking questions. So thank you for convening us.
Yeah, thank you. And hopefully we can continue the dialogue in the future.
So
Yeah,
let me
we should.
Let me thank all three of the presenters and Schmule for his skillful moderation and for launching us into such a fascinating conversation. That last point, I think people who are not academics who are in the audience might not realize how infrequent it is that there are opportunities for people to speak across fields and across disciplines. And as somebody who's in related a little bit to some of this, but it's been just fascinating and so thought-provoking. So thank you for sharing your expertise with all of us. Thanks to everybody who came and joined us for this event. And please do take a look at our website to register for the second round, which is going to be about Jewish nostalgia, a different angle on Jewish memory and Jewish history. That'll take place next Thursday night, and I hope to see many of us there. Have a wonderful night, everyone, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.